And welcome back once again to the adventures of the monk and the monarch. As always, you have me, the monarch, and my co-host, Mildra the monk.
Hello.
Now, today we're doing something similar to what we did a while ago when we talked about the influence of Record of the Lodos War. Only this time we're going to be covering something just a little bit different and talking about the influence of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure.
Yeah, so that means that this series is a motherfucking JoJo reference. But
Now, one thing we could do is list every single thing we know that is a reference to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but that would be at least a 24-hour episode if we were to try to do that.
one of these days I will do a 24-hour stream. Today is not that day. I need a keg of the strongest local beer I can find if I'm gonna do that.
Yes, in contrast to the Lodos War, because JoJo's did have that anime that eventually started coming out. In what year did that actually start airing? Like 2016?
Well, we need to clarify something. Are we talking about the anime that most people have seen over the last decade or so?
Yes.
Or are we talking the first time somebody tried it?
Well, technically, the OVA was the second time. There was a movie that never got officially released before that.
If it wasn't officially released, I don't count it.
It had its own interesting life because it still ended up in college classrooms as like a teaching tool because of some of the techniques it used, which is weird for an unreleased movie to come out and be in American classrooms like that.
Then again, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be surprised if some colleges had copies of Daikon 4.
Yeah, the point is though, with the anime release, the one that was like just the regular episodes, not the OVA, you did see a lot more people discovering a lot about JoJo's over the years and just how important this property actually ended up being. There's a reason the whole "is that a JoJo reference" became a meme. Because so many things are in fact references to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
It was a little bit tricky when we did the influence of Lodos thing because a lot of Lodos's influence is very indirect.
Yeah.
Truth be told, it's only something I'm beginning to fully understand the complete extent of it over the last couple of years as I've been able to get translations of more of the books. Even though Lodos has had like 2 anime, they're only covering the first couple novels in the first series.
And there's also no getting around, Lodos never really had that time it just blew up over here in the West, like JoJo's did. So you didn't have as many people like looking that deep into something like Lodos.
Before the blow up, JoJo was kind of a forbidden fruit where a lot of people really were aware of it, but there was the mindset that because of all of the names, and we'll get to that in a minute, it was never going to come stateside. Then we end up getting it through the whole Shonen Jump Advance line, which was basically the more late teens kind of Shonen Jump. Not quite seinen, but not quite shonen either. The label was more for the US end of Shonen Jump when Viz decided to start bringing that over.
Yeah, JoJo's itself, for those who don't know, the original manga started back in 1987.
Yeah, and Araki looks the exact same then as he does now. I shouldn't be surprised that one of the stories involved vampires because you look at pictures of the creator Araki, he looks the exact same.
This goes beyond that Asians just age very well thing. Because he's just not aged. It's weird.
Yeah. He looks the exact fucking same. It's caused a bit of a running joke that he is a vampire. But yes, this has been around for quite a bit. It is very evident with the style that one of the biggest influences was Hokuto no Ken or Fist of the North Star. I mean, if you look at things like Hamon from the first couple parts, that's not far removed from the martial arts stylings of Fists of the North Star. It just doesn't have the "you're already dead" kind of
Yeah.
moment.
I'll grant Hamon is a lot weirder, but yeah, it's not that far removed.
I don't have any confirmation on this, but I've heard rumors that the reason why Araki shifted into the stand concept was he felt he felt Hamon was too similar to his inspirations with Fist of the North Star. Which,
It's
when you
possible.
look at the outfit, when you look at the appearance of Jonathan Joestar, and then you look at Kenshiro, I could see where he would have that mindset. It's not a one-to-one copy, obviously, but the DNA is still there. It's like how if you even if you completely change your pitching style, if you are left-handed, you're always going to pitch left-handed.
I also think in part, like, you'll notice anyone who's seen a lot of JoJo's, in a way, each part is its own genre to a degree. Like, the JoJo's DNA is going to be there the whole time. But it's always been kind of an ever changing genre of show from part to part. Like, I recall seeing an interview, like, even the idea of stands came before part two, but he wanted that big generational gap, like from the villain of the grandfather coming back and having to deal with the grandson, or be dealt with by the grandson. So part two, to a degree, was just kind of a way to add that gap between one and three. Whether stands themselves were planned before part two, I don't know.
The other thing that was kind of amusing, and I think this was his attempt at writing himself out of a corner, was the naming conventions that would occur with stands. Because Araki has always been a music nerd. That's been clear since day one, even before stands were musical references.
I
I
mean,
think the main reason,
the villain is Dio because
yeah,
he was a fan of Dio.
Dio and Marlon Brando,
Yeah.
which is saying something because as much of an asshole as Dio is, he's nowhere near as much of an asshole as Marlon Brando was. I mean, just look at the whole Apocalypse Now story if you want an example of that, or if you want an even bigger example, look at what happened with him and Val Kilmer with the Island of Dr. Moreau.
But yes, you'll notice there's not really many Japanese musical references in any of his work. He stated this is because he didn't really like Japanese music. You could basically watch or read JoJo's at any point and know what he was listening to at the time.
Yeah, I think one of the early cases of you're trying to be slick with this reference thing was Robert E.O. Speedwagon.
I don't even
Come
like
on, man.
REO Speedwagon, but that was my favorite.
You had one of the villains in part three be literally named Vanilla Ice, and when I was watching the dub of the more recent anime, when we got to Stardust Crusaders, I started a running gag of bitching about every name change that would happen. But the point is that when stands were first introduced, the majority of the stands were named after the tarot. Star Platinum, Magician's Red, Hermit Purple, Hierophant Green, obviously all of those named after the major arcana, and of course the Zowodo being the final the final arcana in the tarot deck, with a little bit of a diversion into Egyptian gods for a handful of them. I have a feeling that that his mindset was like he couldn't do the tarot thing for very long because there's only so many cards in the tarot,
Yeah.
and he had already used a good chunk of them just in part three.
He was out of tarot before he reached the end of part three.
Hmm. So
I mean,
shifting
Vanilla
into
Ice's stand was cream,
yeah,
which is
so,
hilarious all on its own.
so shifting into musical references certainly makes sense, and
They were already ever present.
which is why stand making can become so much fun because you can take any sort of musical reference and make a stand out of that. I certainly did with. I think the other reason the stand concept stuck a lot stronger than Hamon, although he did try and bring it back post reboot, was the fact that there's a lot more you can do with stands. There's no real rule on what a stand can or can't be.
During part 3, it was kind of tame compared to what we would get. Just like basic attack, speed, a few interesting abilities. But then you got into part 4, and things just got weird.
There'd already been a bit of weirdness lampshaded. Of all the first 6 parts, I'd say the most sane one, and I am using massive air quotes when I say this, is Phantom Blood.
That was the very first part, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And this featured, I don't remember who I'm stealing this quote from, but some random guy on Twitter. A purple-haired man punches a tiny frog using sunlight kung fu. That about sums up part 1 right there. And that's the sane one.
The main reason I say it's the sane one is because at the end of the day, there's a lot of the classical tragedy theater in the relationship between Jonathan and Dio. It's also a bit of a lampshade for the fact that Dio was always some degree of evil, like from the word go.
I will use this to point out, like, as absolutely insane as some of the things you will see and can describe in JoJo will be, the actual setup of the stories is pretty simple. Like, you just got 2 brothers, or close enough to brothers anyway, with Dio and Jonathan. Tension between them, one goes evil, then you have just the classic fight between good and evil of Jonathan and Dio. Simple, easy to understand. It's just all of the dressing on it gets a little insane and crazy.
When I look at the first couple parts, it's an interesting observation to make that it's kind of a Rocky trying to stretch his legs and see what he's going to be comfortable with in terms of his particular style. I think that's the best way to describe the way I saw part 1 and 2. Part 1, you have that tale of brothers. Part 2 feels like he may have been cribbing notes from adventure serials and possibly watching Indiana Jones.
I mean, considering all of the other American influences on his work, that would not surprise me.
Yeah, even though he made one of the best characters in that story, a fucking German soldier.
Look, unironically, my favorite character in all of JoJo's is the Nazi. I love Stroheim. The show has you rooting for a Nazi.
If we want to be extremely technical, he wasn't one at that point because the party wouldn't exist. I believe part 2, Battle Tennessee, takes place just a few years before World War II would kick off.
Well, if it was just a few years before, wouldn't that still make him a Nazi? I forget how many years prior to the start of World War II Hitler took power.
It wasn't that many years, but
you could just straight call him a Nazi regardless, and he would still be my favorite character. I love Stroheim so much.
In part due to his insanity, but also the fact that even with how crazy he gets, it is easy to root for somebody who is very much an honorable soldier. Yeah. And he very much is. He just goes at it in the most batshit way possible.
I think part 2 is where you really start to see Araki just let loose.
Especially with having certain running gags like that. Like I say that part 2 feels like a pulp story, like something I would see in a pulp book or something I'd see in an issue of Weird Tales 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Not just because of all the different exotic locales or the like, but also the kind of protagonist that Joseph was compared to his father. His father is trying to be the British gentleman, whereas Joseph was kind of a dick. An arrogant troll, I guess is the way you'd put it, because of the whole thing of predicting exactly what somebody was going to say before they say it.
He's kind of a lovable scoundrel.
That and his favorite tactic of running away. That's why I say that it's in the vein of a adventure serial. Now, obviously, things came into their own with part three. That everybody more or less knows that.
We get the stands.
We have the whole concept of stands. We have the concept of him expanding outward with a lot of the concepts that were present. You also have the fact that it is following through on what he had set up. I should note it's a very bold move to do the whole multiple generations of protagonists per part, since I could easily see a publication saying, "No, we want to stick with this one character who seems to be the draw." I mean, look at what happened when Toriyama tried to have the torch passed on to Gohan, and how that didn't quite pan out. I think the advantage here is there wasn't enough time to really have that attachment set in. When it comes to part three, that one is very much it is still a pulp story, but it is very much focused on the chase. Because the big thing, I talk a lot about the trinity of goal, stakes, and urgency. And with part three, you've got all three of that. You kind of had that in part one and two, but not as much. But with part three, what's the goal? Find Dio and kill him. What's the stakes? Jotaro's mother, possibly dying because of the fact that she could not handle a stand, and the whole family curse because Dio is using Jonathan's body. I believe even in the original Japanese, there was a distinction made between the way Dio's name was written in part one and three, where in part one it was just written normally, whereas in part three it's written as Dio in English caps, mostly because of that massive change. It was part three, I guess, because of how massive a success part three was, that we got our first attempt at it being animated. That's where we get the OVA. And granted, as we talked about in the past, the 90s were kind of a feeding frenzy when it came to that OVA bubble of everybody trying to adapt just about anything into an OVA, even if it wasn't the best idea to do it. Especially if it was something that probably wouldn't have worked for regular television at the time, which Jojo certainly fit that bill.
Yeah. There's also the oddity of how they handled that first OVA, where they released the second half of the story first in case they wouldn't be able to sell enough to justify doing the whole thing.
Which feels like they were banking on getting bailed out by hardcore fans. It's a bold strategy.
I mean, it worked. They released the first half of the series after that.
It's a bold strategy. It's one I can't really sign off on or advise, because that is the equivalent of saying that telling the dealer for a blackjack game that you're going to hit on a 20. And then hope that you don't bust, i.e., get an ace or nothing. There's a part of me that wonders what the animators had thought about how they'd even animate this kind of thing, because I've mentioned this before, but I had someone bring up once, why is it that shonen gets more anime than seinen, or even shoujo in some cases? And if I had to hazard a guess, I would say a lot of shonen anime have very simple designs compared to seinen, so it's easier to transfer onto animation cells. Consider how detailed, say, Vinland Saga is compared to Hiroaka or something,
Yeah.
And you kind of see where I'm getting at.
JoJo's has the additional oddity to work with. It's not just that it's detailed. It's really weird. Like, it is so weird.
I do remember being sent a link to some sort of class or thing that was using as a unorthodox form of yoga Jojo poses. It's effective, I guess. I mean, some of the poses you think you the only way you could pull them off is if you're a contortionist, especially later ones. When I look back at that original OVA, it's one of the things that's tricky to look at in hindsight because of how spoiled we've been with the more recent series. But it's very much a case of its time. I'm trying to think if that came out before or after the Capcom game. That was an interesting move, bringing that to the states when most people wouldn't have even heard of
Yeah.
JoJo stateside.
I think around this time, the people who stateside who knew JoJo's were still a very small subsect of the internet who were reading like the fan translations and scans where part 4 was referred to as Diamond is not Crash.
And then we get that port of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure from Capcom on the Dreamcast. So that would have been about 2000.
There were so many JoJo games that we never even got over here. There was an
I
RPG
understand.
on the Super Nintendo for JoJo's Part 3.
Pretty sure that or something close got fan
Yeah.
translated recently.
The last few years, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm surprised it took so long.
I'm not. I mean, given how it was only this year that we finally got a translation for Dot Hack Link.
Yeah,
When
true.
you're dealing with translating a video game, there's a lot of content that you got to go through.
Yeah. We've touched on that briefly when we talked about stuff like this a couple episodes back.
Even like I knew of JoJo in 2000 to a certain point, but I still thought it was an odd move to bring that stateside.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed that game. I mean, it was a Capcom. I think the mindset was because Capcom was doing so much gangbusters in the arcades, just port everything because well, that was kind of their business model in the
Yeah.
late 90s and early 2000s. Put something out in arcade, if it's a banger, port it to home consoles. We've already talked about how in the early to mid 2000s there was kind of a feeding frenzy for anything anime because the floodgates had been opened up.
That said, I don't think that OVA for JoJo's Part 3 really got big, even amongst that big craze of releases. It was even still then kind of a
It
smaller
didn't.
niche amongst the anime.
It didn't, and I'd say part of the reason why is because the licensor wasn't one of the bigger licensors that
Yeah.
was really making the rounds. I want to say it was Manga Entertainment, but don't quote me on that. It was not.
Yeah, I
When I'm
believe you're
when I'm talking
correct.
about and when I'm talking about the bigger licensors from around that time, I'm mainly talking folks like Viz, ADV, and Bandai/Geneon. Like those were the ones who were grabbing everything, and those were the ones that were getting a lot of the attention. I could also throw in Pioneer, but that's under that Geneon umbrella,
Yeah.
so still technically correct. But if you weren't in one of those distributors umbrellas, then it was harder to get noticed. And
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the distribution, at least stateside, for JoJo was not handled by them. I think it was handled by one of the smaller ones like US Manga Corps or Manga Entertainment, one of those guys. I mean, I did eventually find it on DVD, but that was years later.
And that's one of those that when you look at the DVD prices to get those original releases, it's like, ew, that's gonna hurt to buy that.
I can still see that Gundam Wing collection in the back of my mind taunting me. The
Yeah.
one with that big ass one that was in every video store.
Yeah. But it is kind of weird, like even in Japan, like that was the only animation they had for JoJo's since again, the movie that never got released because Araki realized there's no way to condense part 1 into one movie. So it wasn't from 8 until 87 to those early 2000s, late 90s when that OVA got made. 13 years for a huge manga in Japan before it got animated. And then it wasn't until the full anime we all know now that it actually got animated from the beginning.
In hindsight, it may have been smart for him to wait so long to greenlight any kind of anime, because there was one trend in the 90s and 2000s that's thankfully died off with the shift towards streaming, and that is filler arcs.
Oh god, filler arcs.
Now, a large reason filler arcs were even a thing is because of the fact that you're dealing with weekly TV anime of manga that's still in production, in circulation. So you need these things to buy time for the proper stories to come out in manga and then get animated. Because as Eric and a bunch of others have said, the anime sells the manga sells the anime. That's kind of how it's always worked.
Now, mind you, this has always kind of had issues crop up, like when the author for Dororo died before the manga finished, but that original anime way back was getting made, so they just kind of had to make up their own ending to the show.
Yeah, there are those kind of issues because of that whole buying time. Because of that whole buying time or having to improvise, this is where you get things like, say, how Akira ends, or just the second half of Akira, period, or
The one
the
year of Naruto filler.
obviously Naruto was the big offender when it came to filler, to the point that there was a massive burnout.
Mind you,
Um,
that is not a joke I am telling you people. It literally went on for a year of filler.
mhm.
That was nuts.
Then of course you have the let's fill in an ending ourselves with stuff like the Gonzo Helsing anime.
That was part of that whole let's just kind of make a condensed version of the whole thing that
Mhm.
we got, which I still wish to this day they would give the Get Backers another go like they did with Hellsing Ultimate.
Yeah, I know some people are like, well, if they gave it another go, it would suck like a lot of remixes suck. That's the kind of thing that doesn't really match reality. And I know whenever I bring up the whole fillers thing, somebody inevitably brings up the 2004 Full Metal Alchemist. That was the exception, not the rule. And as far as why that was the exception, I couldn't really tell you.
But yeah, when we get to JoJo's, like it's all done for you. No need for filler. Considering how detailed Araki would probably want that project to be, it's probably a good thing because of the advanced technology allowing him to get a lot more crazy with the animation.
Yeah, this kind of thing would demand a animated JoJo kind of demands not only crazy animation but also detailed. And the 2000s was a very awkward time for a lot of animation studios because they were shifting from the analog style that they had been using since the 70s into using digipaint. Some studios like Madhouse took to it like a duck takes the water. But Madhouse was the rare exception in this case. A lot of imperfections show up when you put some of those early 2000s anime on HD screens, for instance, or even back then there were some messy bits with the animation, especially when you're doing this on a weekly basis. So this is where the modern platform has its advantages in the fact that you can do a few episodes and then take a long break and then do a few more episodes for the next season. But you don't have to keep putting out a new episode every single week for a whole year or so. I'm thinking if there was an attempt tried in like the 2000s, you'd end up with, say, Studio Pierrot handling it, which I like Studio Pierrot, or say Toei Animation, but they would be the complete wrong people to handle it.
Yeah. So yeah, the while it's weird it took so long for JoJo's to get an anime, I think it really served it best to have waited so long.
Yeah, it's one of those things where once you understand the way things were moving in the 2000s and early 2010s, it makes sense. And it could. I'm not saying that the version that we got was in development hell for a few years. It probably wasn't. It was just understood that it would be tricky to animate it. There's also the fact that it probably would be if doing it in the 2000s, it would have been really tempting to try and integrate 2000s CG, which
that, that
I
could have
have
been
ranted
hard.
for many years about obvious CG in various anime. It is a massive pet peeve when there's CG that very much takes me out of the moment. Unless the exception for that is when that CG is used for and that obviousness is used for a purpose, like say the kaiju fights in something like Gridman. In something like that, it there's a legit reason why it's being used. Obviously, when we finally got it, it also meant being able to use some of the musical references, like having yes, ha, having roundabouts yes be the ending theme, prompting the to be continued joke.
Look, I am convinced in part two, there is a moment they just use that opening riff from Owner of a Lonely Heart.
And for the longest time, I figured that trying to do those musical references would be tricky because you'd have to get permissions. But I guess it was either a case of nobody was paying all that much attention, or they got a sweet deal. Then again, I always wondered how Speedgrapher was able to get a Duran Duran song for their opening. So make of that what you will.
I do think it was kind of cool with the anime, like a lot of those ending themes, they were just older songs. Like you had Walk Like an Egyptian for one. I think it was part four had a Savage Garden song for the ending theme.
Then again, I've heard stories that a lot of touring bands really like touring in Japan. So there's certainly that. I do think we missed an opportunity to actually have Shine On You Crazy Diamond at some part in part four.
Oh, that would have been great. That said, I don't know if they wanted to pay that much for those rights. It's probably more
Probably
expensive than a Savage Garden song.
that's also why I'm not going to lose sleep about them not being able to use Queen, because I guarantee you that's going to cost you. That's going to be Final Countdown money, and yes, I'm going to make that joke. I would say when it comes to the whole other people being influenced by JoJo, that really starts with part three. In terms of a couple things. One, the look of Jotaro Kujo was definitely different from other protagonists of the time and even now. And the whole weird hat hair thing that was done has been referenced a lot of time in different media.
That said, a big reason Jotaro probably looked a lot different from other just anime leads is he took a lot of inspiration from Clint Eastwood when designing Jotaro.
Yeah, that tracks.
That was the weird thing with Iraqi. Even in the 80s, he was more into a lot of Western stuff than he was anything going on in Japan.
This is not the first
Yeah.
or last Westaboo that we've covered on this
Yeah.
podcast.
But I think that did a lot to influence his style to make it so much different from whatever else was going on back then.
Now, some people may cringe at at the whole Japanese people being Westaboos thing. I look at it as inspiring because what it ends up showing how you can easily have those cross cultural exchanges because people are fans of the other. Though
There's always the
it does
point where
also
it gets a little cringy with certain people who go way out of their way in some ways, but
yeah,
by
but
and
there's shit
large,
in
yeah,
everybody's yard, so
yeah.
big whoop. Granted, the one avenue of that I have a bit of morbid fascination is is when I see those quote unquote American style restaurants in parts of Japan.
I'm not gonna lie, some of those look fucking delicious.
Oh,
I would
it
eat that.
does, but it's one of those shoes on the other foot moments,
Yeah.
especially given how it's quote unquote American food done with with Japanese sensibilities. like like trying to do a. I think there was one that had a taco, but it was using shredded beef instead of ground beef because it's going to be easy to get shredded beef in Japan. But getting back on the rails, one of the really blatant bits of references was with both the manga and anime versions of Stride. The manga was especially blatant in terms of channeling JoJo, especially like the last three volumes of the Scribed manga, which came out after the anime. I will note, but look at say look at say the Galandu altar, the altar that the big bad of Scribed had at the end of that series, and tell me that's not cribbing notes from Star Platinum. Now, admitted, admittedly, one of the other things that's easy to notice with each of the parts is, as you mentioned, you can use this as a barometer. Each part is a barometer of what Araki was watching or the like. Part four, it's very clear that he was as fascinated with serial killers as some people are nowadays with the whole true crime trend that I've been seeing all over the place. And yeah, in the 90s that's where we started to get that fascination with suburban serial killers in some parts, because Morio Town is a suburban town. I'm just gonna say it right now.
Yeah.
When I see Morio Town, I end up getting reminded of a lot of the smaller medium towns across the Midwest that I lived in, and I'm probably not the only one who thinks that. Obviously, Yoshikage Kira is very much drawing upon the serial killers of the 90s. I'm trying to think if he outright said he was inspired by those sorts of folk.
I don't
Like
recall seeing an interview with Araki saying that, but he was. I will say, just Kira ended up being one of my favorite references, just because his visual design was that of one of the eras of David Bowie. His stand was the Killer Queen, one of which abilities was just, or at one point he gets locked under the gravity. So I was like, huh, that seemed like a very long way to go for an under pressure reference.
Yeah,
but I appreciate it.
That stand had a time loop called "Bites the Dust."
Yeah.
When it came to like part 5, I think that was him trying to see, can I do JoJo without JoJo? I do have to wonder if he was studying the Years of Lead era of Italian history around that time.
It's possible. I'm not very familiar with that myself, so I couldn't say.
There's a lot more. There's a lot that goes into it, but the Years of Lead was a period of a few decades in Italy that was just a criminal shit show of multiple criminal and political organizations all in open conflict with each other. There was a lot of turmoil, and it made for a lot of crime fiction, and also a lot of what's known as giallo or giallo style cinema and book, which were called that because of the yellow outsides of those books, and then that morphed into the early gore films of the 70s in Italy, where guys like Lucio Fulci kind of made their name, because he had to have been watching something from Italian cinema. Otherwise, why would he have an entire part set in Italy?
It wouldn't surprise me.
And of course, there's also the whole thing of what drugs was he on when he was trying to come up with how King Crimson works.
That was rough. I'm not gonna lie. That whole last stretch. I think what ended up happening is he put himself in an odd corner, because there is a moment you have to ask, okay, how can you actually do anything about King Crimson? You can't even really outsmart that nonsense. So you end up with Giorno getting one of the most bullshit overpowered abilities I have ever seen in any show ever.
I will admit, thematically, King Crimson is probably probably has my favorite ultimate fate of any JoJo villain, even though it's the most horrifying fate possible.
Yeah. Holy shit, that was bad.
Because this was somebody who kept trying to master fate, and ultimately he's trapped in it.
I'm not going to go out of my way to try to describe those powers and abilities because that's a bit of a tangled mess that it takes a while to actually explain. I think you went a
Obviously,
little overboard at that point, but yeah.
well, the other big thing that came out of part four was a lot of body horror. So maybe he was watching Cronenberg's movies as well.
Part 5, you mean?
Yeah, part
Yeah,
five.
part 5.
Yeah, part five. Part five has some of the more infamous body horror moments of the whole series. But I can see the whole painting himself into a corner because ever since part three, he kept trying to bring back doing something with messing around with time. Obviously you have the whole thing with Dio being able to stop time with the world. Then with part four, you had Bites the Dust creating a time loop, and part five, you have King Crimson being able to erase time.
Well, erase himself from that stretch of time.
Uh,
Whatever that even actually means.
yeah, I've had it explained to me, but considering how lengthy the explanation was, it is very much a case of this should have been simplified because it creates way too many
Yeah.
problems.
Like, I understand how it works now. It took me a bit to kind of piece it together. My issue comes down is there's no reason King's Crimson should have lost once you understand how that ability works. He could have just won at any point during all of this.
Also, the amount of bullshit when it comes to getting the arrow, then dropping it, but having the arrow bounce right back where it needs to be.
God.
I realize fate and destiny are big themes throughout the JoJo series, but
Look,
I have my limits.
look. In a sense, what happened at the end of part 2 was kind of worse than this, but it kind of just made more sense in part 2 anyway, because of how absolutely goofy it got. Whereas 5 was not that. So it kind of broke me a little more, but
I mean, there's several mini arcs in part five that are borderline horror movies. And
oh,
I'd say one of the big ones was, of course, that whole thing with Green Day.
which one was Green Day?
The one if you did that you had to keep climbing up, otherwise you'd end up rotting,
Oh, yeah.
and culminating in Green Day getting his ass kicked across 7 pages.
What I will say, my absolute favorite reference in all of part 5 was the Grateful Dead because it just made everybody old. I feel like Araki was taking shots at Grateful Dead fans there.
Certainly could have.
Yeah, I haven't
But
actually watched part 6 yet.
yeah, I've read part six. I've watched parts of it. Obviously, the Stone Ocean prison is trying to do a nod to Alcatraz. So I don't know what. Maybe he was watching The Rock around that time. Is there was in the late '90s there was a certain romanticism that was, I won't say romanticism, but a certain mythology about Alcatraz prison.
And
Being on an island and all that.
and you know the one guy group of guys who managed to escape.
To escape the prison that was boasted as being impossible to escape from because it's off the coast. There have been plenty of stories throughout history of people either breaking into or breaking out of fortress style jails. So I could see that kind of thing being an influence, but part 6 is also where we had possibly the final admittance that the whole time control thing had gotten out of hand. With the whole thing with Made in Heaven. Also, just the
I
what
thought
the
that came from a
fuckery
game,
of.
wasn't it? Or was that from part 6?
No, that was from part six. It is somewhat amusing to use that reference since Made in Heaven was one of the last songs that Freddie Mercury had done. Because it was shortly after the album that was on was put out that he had passed away. when it comes to the whole rebooting the whole universe, that's certainly a ballsy move. But I guess he felt that that things needed to be reset because because he had run out of ideas, I guess. But I think it's more that he was doing a passage of time throughout the different parts, but he was running out of years to actually do unless he did it in the future. I think that was a bigger reason for the reset universe thing. There is something horrifying about accelerating time, which I find far more horrifying than the whole Made in Heaven can act within the stopped time of the world.
Yeah, it's possible by that point, like, look, I can't keep escalating powers at this point. Like, seriously, I had a
Mhm.
guy who just could arbitrarily say, no, you didn't do that thing, and now you're locked in a time loop of horror for the rest of eternity. There comes a point you can't top what you've done anymore.
We've seen plenty of creatives just go, I can't I can't go any higher than the peak of the mountain. So I'm not so I have to put this kind of thing on hold or just go on to something else.
Yeah.
I think it's also that the scaling had gotten to a point of where do you go from there? And we've seen a few other works that had a natural endpoint but kept going. Not to pick on DBZ again, but there were multiple points where Toriyama wanted to end it, but they're like, "Hey, can you keep going?"
I don't know if you want a great example. It's the minds behind the project coming to their senses. Is they almost wanted to do more Cowboy Bebop, but there was a point someone said, "Wait, this ended perfectly. Let's not try to expand on this even more and ruin people's fond memories of that ending."
Especially since where where would you even go? Where would you even go with it?
Either A, you would have to somehow say, "Oh, I guess Spike's still alive," or B, a Cowboy Bebop without Spike. Those are your two options.
Neither
Neither.
of which is all that appealing.
Exactly. So I'm glad they kind of thought better of that one.
The problem that that I did end up having and I especially noticed it with Jojo Leon. I haven't seen the most recent part, the part after Jojo Leon, but using the same names as characters pre reboot, but completely different appearances, completely different power sets, and all of that. That I have a bit of an issue with. Having the protagonist for Steel Ball Run be Johnny Joestar. Okay, I'm perfectly fine with that. That's technically not a name that's been. We haven't had a Johnny in that sense, and since it's him going all the way with going full America, I mean the Steel Ball Run is a blatant nod to the Cannonball Run, one of the most famous illegal races in U.S. history.
Yeah.
That bringing back a form of Hamon in the form of spin,
Spin?
which there was already a precedent in the form of the of some of the stuff that Caesar would do. So so bringing that back isn't too much of a stretch. But with Jojolion, you have supposedly Josuke Higashikata. I know I screwed up the name there. My bad. English is my first language, unfortunately. But he looks completely different and has a completely different stand called Soft and Wet. And the ability of that stand is one of those weird ones that I can't describe simply. And I guess the way I describe it is he takes something from his targets, as well as being able to sometimes taking away friction. Since the name Soft and Wet is meant to be a nod to Slippery When Wet, you know, the Bon Jovi album. Parts of JoJolion feel like a fever dream to me. I can't really explain why.
I'm not at all familiar with Jojo Leon. Like
Mhm.
anything after Stone Ocean, like I've not seen Stone Ocean, but I'm aware of a lot of what happens. But everything after, I don't know. I've
But
seen or heard a couple things.
it's the case of you. I know it's meant to be a universal reboot, but using the same names as people pre reboots but having them be completely different characters.
They need to have some actual relation to what they originally were. Otherwise, why are you using that name?
I get the whole it's a whole other universe, but the problem is people are going to be talking about this series, and when they mention Josuke, they shouldn't have to further clarify which one they're talking about.
Let's say we've taken a lot of time talking about some of the ideas and concepts
Mhm.
behind JoJo. We haven't done a
Yeah.
whole lot of talking about the influence all of this has.
And the tricky thing about that is it's never blatant. It's always references here and there. I will say a lot of the references were with. I don't think anyone is going to outright say, "Oh, my work was heavily inspired by JoJo." They're never going to say that directly, unless they're Neil Druckmann. But nobody wants to be Neil Druckmann.
Yeah.
Not even Neil Druckmann wants to be Neil Druckmann. What they're going to say is that they took some elements from it and from a dozen other things. That's going to be how the creative process
Yeah.
works. That's why when it comes to the outright influences, it's going to be in things like design, like the concept of a
Yeah.
stand being used in popular culture, or certain designs like Galandu in the Scribe manga. I've seen some people say that the whole concept of Scribe was cribbing notes from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I think
I
that's a
could
chicken
see
and
it, but
it's a chicken and egg situation.
like JoJo's is definitely heavily responsible for popularizing the idea of some kind of like spirit guardian thing in the form of stands. Like you see it in the Persona games heavily.
You
See it
s-
in
you see
Stride.
you see it in Persona, but I would say you didn't see it in Persona until 3.
Yeah.
Personas were in 1 and 2's. It was still operating largely on the core SMT framework. 3 was where it started to branch off.
You can see all kinds of shows and games that have some kind of concept, and you can trace that right back to JoJo's. Another thing to note, there's a lot of like shonen tropes that were either popularized or started with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. To the
I can
point,
think of a few, but what would be a standout?
I want to say a lot of times when you have like the more really stoic protagonist, that wasn't started there. Like you saw that before, but it's one of the things that kind of got a lot more popular as a result of JoJo's. It's hard because this was so early in the life of just your kind of shonen type anime or manga. Like almost I'd be surprised if more than like 70% of if less than 70% of a lot of the modern shonen anime don't have tropes drawing their line back to JoJo's in some way or another. To the point they probably didn't even consciously take it from JoJo's anymore. It's just become just part of it.
Part of the creative zeitgeist.
Yeah. People are probably putting in stuff that could be seen as a reference to JoJo's, not even knowing it anymore these days. Is how ingrained some of this stuff has gotten. Apparently, you could also, to a degree, trace the love of the Fujoshi back to JoJo's. Seeing the rise of
I'm
that
not gonna,
fun little crowd come up. For those who don't know the Fujoshi, it's the people who like to really ship two male characters from an anime together. Whether they were gay in the show or not, be damned.
I wouldn't be surprised if that really started with some of the online circles, as well as certain editors at various as in various mystery publications.
But there is no getting around a lot of those early JoJo parts. There wasn't a whole lot of focus put on the female characters. So the relationships between all of the men were so much more genuine. It's like, okay, I see why this might have been the start of a lot of the Fujoshi stuff. I would say though, what I would think is probably the biggest thing JoJo's has really influenced is it's another thing like it existed to degrees before, but you'll see in a lot of anime this their ability to take an absolutely ridiculous premise to the point you might think it's a parody. Like if you didn't know anything about JoJo's and you just saw these characters, you might have thought they were a parody of Fist of the North Star. But he takes these absolutely ridiculous things, treats them deadly seriously, and no matter how stupid or ridiculous it gets, he gets you to care and go with it. Like, that's not really a trope or anything specific, but I think he really showcased how far you could push that concept and still get people to genuinely care about what's happening.
Pretty much. It's kind of funny where there's an interesting duality of how people observe JoJo between the people who only know it from the outside looking in and those who actually have watched at least one part. I know some people will be like, well, where do I start? I'm like, you start where you start with any other manga, at chapter 1.
Don't get me wrong, you can jump in at any of the parts, but I think you're best off at the beginning because you get a lot more of the references, the build. It's much better that way, but you can't start anywhere, really.
Well, one of the big appeals with manga over comics is the fact that you have a starting point that is gonna be semi-universal, but that's something I've talked about elsewhere.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think, is when getting back to that whole duality is a lot of people on the outside looking in, they look at the crazy, oh, this is weird, kind of thing, or just hyper focusing on that weirdness. You know, kind of like those cringy ass Japan so weird segments that X Play used to do that they pretend that they didn't.
Yeah.
Or at least Sessler does, but fuck Sessler. And then you have the people who are more familiar with the characters and are able to bring up the fact that there is a lot more complexity with the characters as characters. Like somebody like say Jotaro is not just a catchphrase. I mean, he's kind of standoffish, but he's
Yeah.
not. If I were to do a character study on Jotaro Kujo, I would say that he suffers from an Atlas complex, i.e., thinking that is to hold things up by himself. And even later in life, there's still a tendency for that. That and having to deal with the awkwardness that technically Josuke is his uncle.
I do like how, as Josuke is the bastard son of the Jojo family, it's a bastardized way they get his name to be Jojo. With the kanji for Josuke being the K can also technically be Joe. And that's the only way you can get Jojo out of that name.
Yeah, it's Japanese wordplay. It's fun.
Oh, the one that's the son of Dio is actually Giorno Giovanni.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Gio instead of Jojo.
I look
Not
at that
they
as
call
an
him that.
extension of that stretching your legs thing that I talked about previously. Is another strength of this particular series. You know, that someone would be willing to constantly experiment with themselves instead of resting on laurels.
Yes, I do think at the end of the day that's like that what I mentioned about just seeing how ridiculous you can go and taking things seriously, as well as just establishing a lot of common modern shonen tropes, are going to be the two big legacies this had on media overall. Weirdly enough, none of which has anything to do with the anime, because it was all kind of in play by the time we got the anime. And, you know, on top of that, the sheer volume of actual JoJo references.
Oh, yeah.
Like, not even actual influence, just someone wanting to shout out JoJo's for some reason or another. I think my favorite one was still the very beginning of Puni Puni Puemi, when one of the guys just summons Star Platinum. It's not even a parody of Star Platinum, he just summons Star Platinum. And he gets the response, "Looks like we're gonna have a standoff," from Nabashin.
Which,
well, that had
it's Nabashin. Nabashin is completely out of his mind.
That had to be so confusing to some people when that came out, because so many people had no idea what JoJo's was at that point. And people wonder why Puni Puni Puemi never took off.
When it comes to it, what certainly helps is that there's always going to be a referential nature to geek culture. That applies just as much to people who are geeks when it comes to animation. And I know somebody might say, isn't that hypocritical since you've gotten on people's cases for referencing Akira or the transformation sequence in Sailor Moon? Yes, I have gotten on people for doing that. But this is one of those context is king kind of moments. The reason I get on those kind of references is because the creator will say, "Oh, we're inspired by anime," and that's the only references they use is either the Sailor Moon transformation or the Akira slide. The most basic bitch kind of references that you can make. Like at least give me something like the Etano Laser Circus or the Obari pose if you're going to be going that obvious.
That said, not all of the JoJo's references are too obvious. Like, I think my favorite, just random ass one, is the design for Guile from Street Fighter as a mashup of the Nazi and the Frenchman from JoJo. Stroheim and Polnareff. I had to think of
Yeah.
Polnareff's name for a second there. And they get an American Marine out of that.
Well, do we actually have confirmation that was the inspirations?
I remember seeing the interview. I would have to find it to say for sure, but I'm pretty positive that was in fact in an interview. And once you hear it, you see it.
And once you see, it's the hair. It's the fucking hair.
But it's astonishing, just even without like the influence and style, the sheer volume of stuff that's a reference to something from JoJo's. Like, I think even with that information now, it's possible we here in the West don't really understand how much they love that property over in Japan.
I think a lot of people don't fully. Oh, let me reel myself back a bit. There's a lot of folk who have this, for lack of a better term, Great Wall of China style segregation regarding East and West. That mindset doesn't match reality, especially in the creative space. People are going to draw from anywhere and everywhere. It just whatever happens to inspire them. As a result of that, for as many weeaboos as you might have in the States, you're going to have just as many westaboos in Japan. The presence of that concept is something that will always be an interesting contrast compared to the weeaboos who look in the States who look at, say, anime as this separate thing from the rest of the creative world.
Like, because of the culture it's in, it's definitely going to stand out, and you're very likely to notice huge differences. We're constantly feeding each other. Like, I still remember one of my favorite examples is when I went to see, like, the Lupin the Third movie in theaters when they were doing the Ghibli Fest. You gotta hear some interviews before the movie. The guy who founded Pixar was hugely inspired when he saw Lupin the Third Castle of Cagliostro, because despite how much he studied all of, like, the Western animation techniques, he had no idea how they did anything in that movie, which inevitably inspired him to start learning more about that, and inevitably led him to form Pixar.
And I do remember watching this marathon back when I still had cable. I think it was on TMC, where they were going through different Miyazaki movies, and that was actually the first time I saw things like Porco Rosso and Whisper of the Heart, which are some of my favorites when it comes to Studio Ghibli. One of the people who was in the interlude parts where they were just talking about the movie that they were about to watch was one of the staffers at Pixar. And you could tell by the way he talked that he knew his stuff when it came to animation and when it came to Studio Ghibli. And if you go back and look, you see the references, you see the inferences and the like. That's the key difference. The reason I get on people when they want to act like it's a big deal that they reference the Akira slide is because they are the emperor with no clothes, prancing about in the public square. You're not going to get a gold star for doing what everybody else does. Fuck, everybody's done the Akira slide at some point. Pretty sure I have, and I don't even do animation. I think if there's any coda, it's that don't be afraid of experimentation, because Lord knows Araki certainly isn't. I'm pretty sure whatever he does next, he's going to be trying to experiment with his formula instead of resting on laurels, even if it doesn't work out as well as other parts. But I'd say I'd say that's as good a spot as any to cap it off before we end up having to reboot the whole show.
Yeah. I will ask though, just out of curiosity, what is your favorite JoJo's part that you've seen so far or read?
Honestly, part four.
It's up there. I still gotta go part 2 though. Just I love Joseph. Every moment he's on screen, it's just fantastic. Part 4 is probably my second favorite.
Yeah, I could definitely see it.
Yeah, so with that, it's been fun talking about JoJo's. It's always. But with that, we wrap everything up here. And I guess we will see you next month on the next adventures of the Monk and the Monarch.
Stay frosty.